The second scan came back wrong, and I blamed the machine. I have run the Holomere Recovery Annex for 11 cycles, and in that time I have learned exactly one thing worth knowing about a frontier triage ward: the imaging array's drift. Cold nights, power surges, a junior tech who forgets to recalibrate before shift change, any of it can shave a few percentage points off a tissue density reading and send you chasing a ghost. So when Corporal Dane Ashworth's intake scan showed a 4 centimeter laceration across his forearm, and the follow-up scan 6 hours later showed 3 centimeters, I wrote it off as drift and moved to the next bed. Ashworth was unremarkable in every other way. Human, mid-30s, a field engineer attached to a salvage unit that had taken indirect fire near the verge line. Shrapnel laceration, forearm, moderate blood loss, a hairline fracture in the same limb. Nothing in his chart suggested he would still be occupying my attention 3 days later. I sutured the wound myself. 12 stitches, clean closure, standard antiseptic wrap. I told him, through the translator collar, that he'd be in the annex for at least a week, longer if the fracture didn't set cleanly. He nodded, asked if the cafeteria served anything that wasn't reconstituted protein, and went to sleep. By the next scan, the laceration measured 1.8 centimeters. I pulled the sutures myself to check. They were still in place, still doing their job along a wound that had no business being half its original length. I called in technician Oru, my most careful reader, and had her run the scan again on a second unit. Same result. I had her cross-reference the machine's last 3 calibration logs. Clean. I had her pull the archived baseline for human dermal repair rates from the compendium, the standard reference for how fast any of the 412 catalogued sapient species close a wound of this class. Humans, by that record, were unremarkable. Slower than some species, faster than others. A laceration like Ashworth's should have taken 9 to 12 days to fully resolve, assuming no infection. It had resolved roughly 40% of the way in under 20 hours. I told myself it was the suturing, a particularly good closure, perhaps a slight overestimate on the intake measurement. I adjusted my own internal explanation twice that night before I admitted neither one held. On day 2, I tightened the protocol myself, hourly imaging instead of twice daily. I had Oru photograph the wound directly, not just scan it, so there could be no argument about instrument drift. I checked the fracture too, almost as an afterthought, and found the hairline crack in his radius already showing the faint shadow line of new bone deposition, a process that, by every record I had, should not begin in earnest for another 4 to 6 days. I went to Ashworth's bedside and asked him, plainly, whether he had received any treatment before arrival. Stims, regenerative compounds, anything from his own people's field kits that might explain an accelerated repair. He said no. He said his unit didn't carry anything like that. Too expensive, too rare, reserved for officers who'd never actually go near the line. He said it without resentment, the way you'd note the weather. Then he asked, mildly, whether something was wrong with his arm. I told him no. I was lying, and I think he knew it, and he didn't push. By the morning of day 3, the laceration was a hairline. Not healed, closing, the edges drawing together with a steadiness that the photographs caught frame by frame, hour by hour, like something being slowly erased rather than slowly mended. I stood over the bed at the 0400 imaging pass and watched Oru's hand shake slightly as she logged the measurement. "Doctor," she said. It moved while I was scanning it. I looked. She was right. The edge of the wound had visibly drawn a fraction closer together in the 90 seconds the scan took to complete. Not an artifact. Not a trick of the readout. I watched it happen with my own eyes, in real time, on a patient who was awake, alert, and asking again whether breakfast might include something with actual flavor in it. I filed an internal flag that morning. Standard procedure for an unexplained physiological anomaly. Nothing alarming on paper, just a request for a second medical opinion. I did not expect compliance to answer within the hour. I did not expect them to send someone in person. Inspector Vedhel Korash arrived by midday, a Therenic compliance officer with the flat, unhurried manner of someone who has spent a long career discovering that most flagged anomalies are nothing. She reviewed Oru's photographs in silence, scrolled back through the imaging logs twice, and then asked to see the patient. She did not introduce herself to Ashworth as an inspector. She told him she was a specialist consulting on his case, which was true enough, and asked if she could examine the wound directly. He shrugged and held out his arm like he was handing over a tool for someone else to look at. Korash pressed 2 fingers either side of the laceration, gently, testing the give of the tissue. Then she asked him to move his hand, make a fist, extend the fingers, rotate the wrist. He did, without hesitation, without the careful wince I would have expected from a fracture not yet 5 days old. "Does that hurt?" she asked. "A little," Ashworth said. "Felt worse yesterday." Korash looked at me. I had nothing to offer her that wasn't already in the file. She ordered full-spectrum continuous monitoring, every imaging modality the annex carried, running simultaneously, recording without interruption. Not hourly passes. Constant. She wanted, she said, to see the mechanism, not just the result. I had never run a full-spectrum continuous capture on a single patient in 11 cycles of running this ward. We didn't have the protocol for it. Korash wrote one in 40 minutes, standing at my station, and I signed off on it because I no longer trusted my own judgment enough to argue. We caught it that night. At 23:17, the deep tissue scanner recorded a cluster of cellular activity at the wound margin that the system's own diagnostic flagged as anomalous. Recommend recalibration. Korash overrode the flag and kept recording. At 23:31, the activity had not stopped. It had organized, a visible front of repair advancing along the wound bed at a rate the machine's standard library had no classification for. By 2400, the laceration that had measured a hairline at dawn was a faint pink line, smooth, already losing the raised texture of new scar tissue. Ashworth slept through all of it. Korash and I stood over the monitors and watched a wound disappear in real time on a sleeping man who had complained, 20 minutes earlier, that the ward kept the lights too bright. "This is not suppressed inflammation," Korash said quietly, more to herself than to me. "This is not a clotting variance. This is active reconstruction, continuous, with no apparent fatigue curve.
No fatiga curva, irrapata.
Every regenerative process we have on record slows as it nears completion. Diminishing returns. This is not slowing." She gestured at the readout, where the rate of cellular reorganization sat almost flat across 6 hours of continuous recording. "It is proceeding as if it intends to finish." By the time the fracture shadow line had thickened into true bone, on the morning of day 5, Korash had stopped asking me questions and started drafting her report directly. I read it over her shoulder, which I should not have done, and which she did not stop me from doing. The classification she proposed for Ashworth's case sat in a tier of the compendium I had never had occasion to open. Not disease, not enhancement, not anomaly in the sense of malfunction. A baseline revision. A note, appended to the species-wide entry for humans, flagging that the existing repair rate data might reflect injury severity below some threshold the compendium had never needed to define before, because no other catalogue species had a threshold worth finding. "You understand what this means operationally," Korash said, still writing. "Every human casualty report we have on file, every field medical estimate, recalculated." I understood. I had been the one standing at the bedside watching a wound erase itself, hour by hour, on a man who slept through the discovery that would reorganize 412 species worth of comparative medical doctrine. On day 6, Ashworth asked to be discharged. The fracture had set. The laceration was a faint line that would, by every projection we now trusted, fade to nothing within the month. He could flex the wrist without pain. He had, by his own account, felt mostly fine since day 3 and had simply assumed the rest of us were being thorough. I told him, before he left, what we'd found, the rate, the lack of fatigue, the report Korash had already filed up the chain. I tried to convey the scale of it, the 412 species, the baseline revision, the fact that he had, without doing anything at all, rewritten a fixed point in our medical doctrine simply by lying in a bed and healing the way his body apparently always healed. He listened to all of it, working his stitched then unstitched forearm slowly, testing the grip. "Huh," he said. "Guess that's why the field medics always say I'm easy." He picked up his kit and walked out under his own power, favoring nothing, and went back to his unit at the verge line 3 days ahead of the next worst case in the ward. Korash's report went up the chain that same week. I do not know what became of it beyond my own station, only that the compendium's human entry now carries an addendum, and that the addendum cites Holomere Recovery Annex as the originating case file. I have not been called to testify on it. I do not expect to be. The data spoke for itself, hour by hour, on a continuous recording that none of us could argue with afterward, because none of us had blinked. I still run this ward. I still see human casualties come through on stretchers that any other species would not walk away from. I have stopped assuming I know, on sight, how long their recovery will take. I order the scans. I wait for the numbers to contradict themselves. And when they do, I no longer call it drift.